I remember the exact moment it all fell apart. I was sitting in the living room, sipping a lukewarm glass of wine, pretending to watch a show I couldn't focus on. My name's Eva, I'm 34, and I should have known better. But should-haves don't change reality. The air was thick with an unspoken tension I didn't fully understand yet, and when my husband, Mark, walked into the room, his face was unreadable, too calm, too composed. He didn't sit down, he just stood there, looking at me like I was someone he didn't recognize. It was a Wednesday night, nothing extraordinary, just another monotonous evening. At least, that's what I thought. Mark was holding his phone in his hand, gripping it so tightly his knuckles were white. He didn't say anything at first, and, in those seconds of silence, I felt the weight of something looming. It's strange how instincts kick in. I knew, even before he spoke, that whatever he was about to say would destroy the life we'd built together. "Do you have anything to tell me?" His voice was steady, but the words were razor-sharp, cutting through the fragile air between us. I froze. It wasn't the kind of question you ask without already knowing the answer. My mind raced through every possibility, every secret I had buried, every moment I had prayed would stay hidden. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Mark took a step closer, his eyes never leaving mine. "Eva," he said again, more firmly this time, "do you have anything to tell me?" My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. The wine glass in my hand felt slippery, and I placed it down on the coffee table, afraid I might drop it. "What are you talking about?" I managed to say, though my voice sounded foreign to my own ears. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he unlocked his phone and turned the screen toward me. My stomach dropped as I saw the messages. It wasn't just one. It wasn't even two. There were 3 separate conversations, each with a name I recognized instantly: David, Ben, and Luke, my husband's friends. The room seemed to tilt, my vision narrowing as I stared at the damning evidence in front of me. I couldn't deny it. I couldn't twist my way out of it. The words were there, in black and white, taunting me. I can explain," I stammered. But the truth was I couldn't. Not in any way that would make this okay. Mark's composure finally cracked, and he let out a bitter laugh. "Explain? Are you serious, Eva? Explain what? How you decided to sleep with 3 of my friends, or how you thought you could get away with it?" His voice was rising now, and each word felt like a slap to my face. "I didn't mean for it to happen," I said weakly, tears welling up in my eyes. It was a pathetic excuse, and I knew it. But what else could I say? He shook his head, his expression a mixture of disbelief and disgust. "Didn't mean for it to happen?" he repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "What, you just accidentally fell into bed with them? 3 times? "I was lonely," I blurted out, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "You were always working late, always distracted. I felt invisible, Mark." For a moment, he just stared at me, his mouth opening slightly as if he wanted to respond but didn't know how. Then he turned away, running a hand through his hair. "So, that's your excuse? I wasn't paying enough attention to you, so you decided to screw my friends?" "It wasn't like that," I said, my voice cracking. "I made a mistake." "Mistakes," he interrupted sharply. "Plural. Let's not pretend this was a one-time thing, Eva. You had a pattern." I didn't know what to say to that because he was right. It wasn't a one-time thing. It was a series of choices, each one worse than the last. And now, here we were, standing in the wreckage of what used to be our marriage. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. I wanted to reach out to him, to somehow make him understand how broken I had felt, how desperate I had been for some kind of validation. But how do you explain that to someone you've betrayed so deeply? Finally, Mark spoke again, his voice quiet but filled with an edge of finality. "I need some time to think," he said. "And honestly, I don't even know if I want to come back after this." He grabbed his keys and walked out the door, leaving me alone with the shattered pieces of my life. As the sound of his car engine faded into the distance, I sat there in the silence, unable to move, unable to think. The tears came then, hot and relentless, but they didn't bring relief. They only served as a reminder of what I had done and what I had lost. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the empty space where Mark had been. The wine and Neem. My glass had gone untouched, its surface trembling slightly as if it, too, felt the weight of what had just happened. My mind was a mess of thoughts, some frantic, some eerily calm. The images of those messages kept flashing in my head, and every time they did, I felt a fresh wave of nausea. I couldn't blame him for walking out. If the roles were reversed, I don't think I could have stayed in that room either. But now that I was alone, all I could think about was how it had gotten to this point. It wasn't just about Mark finding out. It was about everything leading up to that moment. The choices I made, the justifications I gave myself, the guilt I ignored. I remember the first time it happened. David. It was a party at our house, a casual gathering with friends, nothing out of the ordinary. Mark had been his usual self, playing host, making sure everyone had a drink in their hand, chatting and laughing like everything in the world was perfect. And maybe for him it was. But for me, I felt like a ghost. People saw me, sure, but they didn't really see me, not like they used to. I'd been nursing my third glass of wine, standing off to the side while everyone else mingled. That's when David walked over. He was charming in a way that felt almost rehearsed, but that night, I didn't care. He asked me how I was doing, and before I could give him the usual, "I'm fine," something in his tone made me pause. He didn't sound like he was just making small talk. He sounded like he actually wanted to know. We talked for what must have been hours, long enough for the party to dwindle and the house to grow quieter. Mark was busy cleaning up in the kitchen, oblivious to the way David leaned in a little too close, the way his hand lingered on my arm when he laughed at something. I said, I should have pulled away. I should have ended the conversation, thanked him for coming, and gone to bed. But I didn't. Later that night, when everyone had left, I found myself in the guest bedroom with David. I don't remember how it started. Maybe I don't want to remember, but I do remember the way he looked at me, like I was the center of the universe, like I mattered in a way I hadn't felt in years. It was intoxicating. It was stupid. It was the beginning of everything falling apart. After David, there was Ben, and then Luke. Each time I told myself it would be the last. Each time I promised I would never let it happen again. And yet, every time I found myself making the same mistake, falling into the same pattern. I knew it was wrong. God, I knew. But there was a part of me that didn't care. Or maybe it was a part of me that cared too much about the wrong things. The worst part was the guilt. It wasn't just guilt about what I was doing to Mark. It was guilt about the lies I was telling myself. I kept convincing myself that I deserved this, that I needed it to feel whole again. But deep down, I knew I was only digging myself into a deeper hole, one that I couldn't climb out of. And now, here I was, sitting alone in the wreckage of my choices. Mark was gone, and I didn't know if he would come back. A part of me wanted to call him, to beg him to come home, to tell him I'd do whatever it took to fix this. But another part of me, the part that was drowning in shame, knew I had no right to ask for his forgiveness. Not after what I had done. I reached for my phone, scrolling mindlessly through my contacts. My fingers hovered over Mark's name, but I couldn't bring myself to press it. Instead, I opened the group chat with David, Ben, and Luke. The messages were still there, staring back at me like a cruel reminder of my own destruction. I felt a sudden surge of anger, at them, at myself, at the whole damn situation. How had I let this happen? How had I allowed myself to destroy the one thing that had ever truly mattered to me? The questions swirled in my mind, each one more painful than the last. I wanted answers, but I knew they wouldn't come easily. Not tonight. Not ever. I put the phone down and buried my face in my hands. The tears came again, but this time, they weren't just tears of guilt or regret. They were tears of realization that no matter what happened next, no matter how much I wanted to fix this, some things couldn't be undone. The morning after felt like waking up from a nightmare, except this one was real. and there was no escape from it. I had barely slept. The house was eerily silent, every sound amplified by the absence of Mark. His side of the bed was untouched, a cold, empty reminder of everything that had happened the night before. I sat on the edge of the mattress, staring at the floor, trying to piece together a plan. What do you even do after something like this? Do you wait for the person you've hurt to come back? Do you try to reach out and risk making things worse? Or do you just sit with the mess you've made and hope somehow that time will fix it? The guilt was suffocating. It wasn't just about what I'd done, it was about why I'd done it. I kept replaying the moments in my head, trying to pinpoint the exact second I had crossed the line. Was it the first time I felt ignored by Mark? The truth was, I didn't know how to apologize for something so massive, so unforgivable. I'd spent months justifying my actions to myself, convincing myself that I was the victim in some twisted way. That Mark's long hours at work, his emotional unavailability, his occasional bouts of indifference, had somehow driven me to seek comfort elsewhere. But now, sitting here in the freezing cold, I couldn't ignore the other side of it, the part of me that had made the choice, over and over again, to betray him. The part of me that had taken the easy way out instead of confronting the problems in our marriage. I stayed there until the sun started to set, the sky turning shades of orange and pink that felt almost too beautiful for a day like this. As the temperature dropped, I finally forced myself to head home. The house was just as I'd left it, quiet, still, oppressive in its emptiness. I walked into the living room and stood there for a moment, taking it all in. The wine glass was still on the coffee table, a faint red stain at the bottom like a reminder of the night before. I picked it up and carried it to the kitchen, rinsing it out in the sink. The mundane act felt strangely grounding, like I was trying to reclaim some semblance of normalcy, even though nothing about this was normal anymore. I grabbed a notebook from the drawer near the fridge and sat at the kitchen table. Writing had always been my way of sorting through my thoughts, of making sense of the mess in my head. I opened the notebook to a blank page and stared at it for a while, the pen hovering above the paper. Finally, I started to write. Mark, I don't know where to start or if you'll even read this, but I need to try because there are things I need to say, even if they don't fix anything. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't know if I'd forgive me if I were you, but I want you to know that this wasn't about you, not really. It was about me, about all the things I've been too afraid to face, my insecurities, my fears, my need to feel wanted. I let those things control me, and in the process, I hurt you in ways I can't take back. I stopped, the words blurring on the page as tears filled my eyes. I wiped them away quickly and kept writing. You're the best thing that ever happened. To me, and I threw it away. I told myself so many lies to justify what I was doing, but the truth is, there's no excuse for it. You didn't deserve this, Mark. You deserved better, and I failed you. I know I can't undo what I've done, but I want you to know that I'm going to try to be better. Not for you, because I know that's not fair to ask, but for myself. Because if I don't, then all of this will have been for nothing. I hope you find whatever it is you need, whether it's with me or without me. You deserve happiness, even if it's not with me. I'm sorry. For everything. I put the pen down and stared at the letter, my hands trembling. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't change anything, but at least it was honest. I folded the letter and placed it on the kitchen counter where I knew he'd see it when he came back. Then I turned off the lights and went upstairs, crawling into bed and pulling the covers over me. The house was too quiet, too empty, but for the first time I didn't fight it. I let it swallow me whole. The next morning, the silence of the house pressed on me like a weight I couldn't shake. I had slept restlessly, my dreams fragmented, and filled with Mark's face, his eyes full of hurt, his voice echoing words I couldn't quite make out. I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all, my body heavy with exhaustion and dread. I dragged myself downstairs, half hoping to see his car in the driveway or hear the faint clink of him making coffee in the kitchen. But the house was just as empty as it had been the night before. The letter I'd left sat untouched on the counter, a stark reminder of his absence. For hours I paced the house, my thoughts racing in circles. I replayed every fight we'd ever had, every moment where I'd felt unseen or unimportant, and every opportunity I'd had to tell him how I was feeling but didn't. It all seemed so clear now, in hindsight, how the cracks in our marriage had formed. But clarity didn't matter if it came too late. By mid-morning, I couldn't take the stillness anymore. I needed to get out of the house, to do something, anything, to distract myself from the suffocating guilt and anxiety. I grabbed my coat and keys, not knowing where I was going, and got in the car. As I drove aimlessly through the city, I found myself drawn to familiar places, spots where Mark and I had spent time together, back when things were simpler. The cafe where we had our first date, the park where he proposed, even the quiet little bookstore where we used to spend lazy Sunday afternoons browsing for novels we'd never actually finish. Each place felt like a punch to the gut, a reminder of what I had thrown away. The first time I let myself believe that someone else's attention could fill the void? Or was it something deeper, something I hadn't even admitted to myself? I wandered into the kitchen, my bare feet cold against the tile. The coffee pot sat on the counter, untouched since yesterday. I didn't bother making a fresh pot. Instead, I leaned against the counter, staring out the window at the empty driveway, willing Mark's car to appear. The minutes dragged into hours, and still, no sign of him. I checked my phone obsessively, hoping for a message, a missed call, anything to let me know where he was, what he was thinking. But there was nothing. Just silence. By mid-afternoon, the anxiety was too much to bear. I needed to do something, anything, to distract myself. I grabbed my coat and decided to take a walk. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that stings your lungs with every breath. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional car passing by. It gave me too much time to think, and thinking was the last thing I wanted to do. As I walked, I found myself drifting toward David's neighborhood. I hadn't planned it, but my feet seemed to have a mind of their own. Before I knew it, I was standing outside his house, staring at the front door like it held all the answers I was looking for. I knew I shouldn't be there. I knew it was reckless, selfish even, to seek him out after everything that had happened. But in that moment, I wasn't thinking about consequences. I was thinking about survival, about finding something, someone, to anchor me in the chaos. I knocked before I could change my mind. The sound echoed in the quiet, making my heart race. For a moment, I thought he might not be home, and a part of me was relieved. But then the door opened, and there he was, looking just as surprised to see me as I felt to be there. "Eva," he said, his voice low. "What are you doing here?" I opened my mouth to answer, but the words got caught in my throat. "How do you explain showing up unannounced at the house of the man who helped you? Ruin your marriage?" "I don't know," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. I needed to talk to someone." He stepped aside, letting me in. The house was warm, the smell of coffee lingering in the air. I felt a pang of jealousy at the normalcy of it all. How was it that his life seemed so untouched by what we had done, while mine was crumbling around me? We sat in the living room, the silence stretching between us like a chasm. David looked uncomfortable, his gaze flickering between me and the floor. "You shouldn't have come here," he said eventually, his tone more resigned than angry. "I know," I admitted, "but I didn't know where else to go." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Eva, this isn't going to fix anything." "I'm not looking to fix anything," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't entirely true. I don't know. What to do, David? Mark knows. He saw the messages." His expression shifted, a flicker of guilt crossing his face. "What did he say?" "He left," I said simply. "And I don't know if he's coming back." David didn't say anything, and for the first time since I'd walked through the door, I felt the weight of what I was doing. This wasn't just about me anymore. It wasn't just my life that was falling apart. It was his, too. "I shouldn't have come here," I said, standing up abruptly. "I'm sorry. This was a mistake." "Eva, wait," he said, but I was already moving toward the door. I didn't stop until I was back outside, the cold air hitting me like a slap. I didn't know where I was going or what I was going to do next, but one thing was clear. I couldn't keep running to the people who had helped me destroy everything. If there was any hope of salvaging what was left of my life, it had to start with me. I didn't go home right away. The idea of stepping back into that empty house, where every corner was steeped in memories of Mark, felt unbearable. Instead, I wandered aimlessly through the city, letting the cold wind bite at my face and numb the edges of my thoughts. I replayed the confrontation in my head, dissecting every word, every glance, every moment that led to Mark walking out the door. His face when he showed me the messages was burned into my memory, a mixture of disbelief and devastation that I could never erase. How had I let things get this far? Eventually, I found myself at a small park, the kind that's mostly deserted in the winter months. I sat on a bench, my breath visible in the icy air, and stared at the frozen pond in front of me. It was so still, so unbothered by the chaos in my life, and for a moment I envied it. I thought about calling Mark. My phone was heavy in my pocket, a constant reminder of the silence between us. But every time I reached for it, I hesitated. What could I even say? Sorry? Sorry wasn't enough. Not for this. I parked near the bookstore and walked the streets for a while, my mind a whirlwind of memories and regret. Eventually, I found myself standing in front of another house, Ben's. My stomach twisted at the sight of it, the memories of that night, flooding back like a tidal wave. I hadn't seen or spoken to him since everything came out. Part of me wanted to confront him, to ask him why he'd been so reckless in those messages. But another part of me knew that wasn't fair. I turned away from the house, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. I couldn't keep running to the people who had been part of the problem. This wasn't about them anymore. It was about me and the choices I had made. As I walked back to my car, my phone buzzed in my pocket. My heart jumped, hoping against hope that it was Mark. But when I pulled it out, I saw a name I hadn't expected. Luke. I hesitated before answering, my fingers hovering over the screen. Finally, I took a deep breath and hit accept. Hello? Eva, Luke's voice came through, calm and measured. I've been meaning to call. I heard about Mark. Yeah, I said, my throat tight. He knows about everything. There was a long pause on the other end. I'm sorry, Luke said finally. I didn't mean for things to spiral like this. I don't think anyone did, I replied, my voice flat. Have you talked to him? No, I admitted. He left, and I don't know if he's coming back. Another pause. Do you want him to? His question caught me off guard. Did I want Mark to come back? Of course I did, didn't I? But even as the answer formed in my mind, doubt crept in. Did I deserve for him to come back? I don't know, I said finally, the words feeling like a confession. Luke sighed. For what it's worth, I think you should tell him that. Whatever you're feeling, own it. He deserves to hear the truth. The truth. The word hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. I nodded, even though Luke couldn't see me. Thanks, I said softly, and hung up. Driving home, I thought about what Luke had said. Owning the truth felt like the only way forward, but it also terrified me. The truth wasn't just that I had betrayed Mark. It was that I didn't fully understand why. And if I couldn't figure that out, how could I expect him to even consider forgiving me? When I got home, I sat at the kitchen table again, staring at the letter I'd written the night before. It wasn't enough. I needed to do more, to say more, to dig deeper than I had ever dared. So I started writing again, this time with no filter, no attempt to make myself look better or soften the blow. I wrote about the loneliness I'd felt, the resentment I'd buried, the mistakes I'd made. I wrote about the fear of losing Mark that had always been there, even before I gave him a reason to leave. And as I wrote, for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of something I hadn't expected. Hope. Not hope that everything would magically be okay, but hope that maybe, just maybe, I could start to make sense of the chaos I had created. The hours ticked by in a blur as I sat at the table, pouring every ounce of myself into that second letter. By the time I finished, it was dark outside, the faint hum of streetlights filtering through the windows. My hand ached from gripping the pen, and the pages in front of me were filled with words, raw, unfiltered, and messy, but mine. This letter wasn't just for Mark anymore. It was for me. A mirror held up to every corner of myself I'd avoided for so long. The anger, the sadness, the fear. It was all there, sprawled across the pages like an unvarnished truth I couldn't escape. When I finally set the pen down, I felt hollowed out, like I'd drained every emotion I had left. But there was also a strange sense of relief, as if naming everything I'd kept buried had lifted some of the weight off my chest. I folded the letter carefully and placed it next to the first one on the counter. I wasn't sure if Mark would ever read them, but at least they were there, waiting for him, should he decide to come back. The next morning, I woke to the sound of the front door opening. My heart leapt into my throat as I sat up in bed, straining to hear. Footsteps echoed down the hallway, measured and deliberate, and then the faint rustle of papers. Mark was home. I scrambled out of bed, my pulse pounding in my ears, and made my way downstairs. He was standing in the kitchen, holding the letters. His expression was unreadable, his face pale and drawn. He didn't look at me as I entered the room, his focus fixed on the papers in his hands. "Mark," I started, but my voice faltered. He glanced up at me then, his eyes piercing and heavy with emotion. "You wrote this?" he asked, holding up the second letter. I nodded, my throat tight. I didn't know how else to say it. He let out a long, shaky breath and set the letters down on the counter. "It's a lot to process," he said, his voice quieter than I expected. "I know," I whispered, stepping closer but keeping my distance. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Mark. I needed you to know everything, to understand." He was silent for a long time, his gaze dropping to the floor. "You think this explains it?" he asked finally, his tone tinged with disbelief. "Eva, I don't even know who you are anymore. How am I supposed to process this when I don't recognize the person who wrote it?" His words hit me like a slap, but I couldn't argue with them. He was right. I didn't recognize myself either. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice breaking. "I don't have the answers, Mark. All I know is that I'm trying to figure it out. I know I've hurt you, and I know I can't undo that. But I'm trying. That's all I can do." He looked at me then, and for a moment, I thought, I saw a flicker of something, softness maybe, or the faintest hint of understanding. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a weariness that made my chest ache. "I need time," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "I can't make any decisions right now. I need space to think." "I understand," I said, though the words felt hollow. He picked up the letters and folded them carefully, tucking them into his jacket. "I'll stay with a friend for a while," he added, avoiding my gaze. "You can have the house." I wanted to beg him to stay, to tell him that we could work through this together, but I knew it wouldn't help. He needed space, and I had to respect that. As he walked toward the door, I found myself calling out, "Mark?" He stopped but didn't turn around. "For what it's worth," I said, my voice trembling, "I love you. I never stopped loving you." He stood there for a moment, his back to me, before nodding once and walking out the door. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there, staring at the closed door, unsure of what to do next. Part of me wanted to scream, to cry, to chase after him and beg him to come back. But another part of me knew that this was just the beginning of a much longer journey. For the first time, I was forced to confront the reality that love wasn't enough to fix what I'd broken. I had to find a way to rebuild, not just my relationship with Mark, but myself. And that wasn't something I could do overnight. So, I sat back down at the kitchen table, staring at the empty space where the letters had been, and prepared myself for the long, uncertain road ahead. The days after Mark left were excruciatingly quiet. Without him, the house felt too big, the silence too loud. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows reminded me that he wasn't there. I wandered from room to room, restless but unable to focus on anything. I tried to distract myself with mundane tasks, cleaning, organizing, even rearranging the furniture. But no matter what I did, my thoughts always drifted back to him. I replayed our last conversation over and over, dissecting his words, his expressions, the tone of his voice. He had taken the letters, which I told myself was a good sign. But the way he'd looked at me, that emptiness in his eyes haunted me. One evening, I decided to go through an old box of photographs we kept in the closet. I hadn't touched it in years, but I needed something to hold on to, some tangible reminder of the life we'd built together. The first photo I pulled out was from our wedding day. Mark was smiling that big, goofy grin I'd fallen in love with, his arm around me as we stood beneath an arch of flowers. I traced his face with my finger, my chest tightening with a mix of love and regret. There were pictures of our honeymoon in Italy, snapshots from road trips, and silly selfies we'd taken in the early days of our relationship. Each one was a reminder of how happy we'd been, how connected we'd once felt. And each one was a painful reminder of how far we'd drifted from that. As I sifted through the photos, I found one that stopped me cold. It was from a dinner party we'd hosted about a year ago. Mark was sitting at the head of the table, laughing at something one of his friends had said. And there, sitting just a few seats away, was Ben. I stared at the photo, my stomach twisting into knots. It was surreal to see them both in the same frame, smiling and laughing as if nothing had ever happened. I wondered if Ben had felt any guilt that night, knowing what we'd done. Or had he been able to compartmentalize it, to separate the man at the table from the man who shared my secret? The thought made me sick to my stomach, and I shoved the photo back into the box. I couldn't keep torturing myself like this. Later, that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I thought about what Mark had said before he left. "I don't even know who you are anymore." The words echoed in my head like a taunt. Who was I? I didn't have an answer. Somewhere along the way, I had lost sight of myself. I had become someone I barely recognized, someone capable of lying, of betraying, of hurting the person I loved most. The realization was both devastating and oddly clarifying. If I didn't know who I was, then maybe it was time to find out. The next morning, I made a list. It was something I hadn't done in years, writing out goals, plans, steps to take. But I needed direction, something to focus on besides my own guilt and regret. At the top of the list, I wrote, therapy. I had always avoided it, convincing myself that I could handle things on my own. But now I realized how much I needed help. Help to understand my choices, to confront the parts of myself I'd been too afraid to face. Next, I wrote, apologies. Not just to Mark, but to everyone I had hurt. To the people I had dragged into my mess, knowingly or unknowingly. I wasn't sure if they would accept my apologies, but I needed to try. The third item on the list was simply, be better. It was vague, but it felt right. I didn't know what better looked like yet, but I knew it had to start with honesty, with myself and with others. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. Not that everything would be okay, but that I had a chance to make things right, even if only in small ways. As I folded the list and placed it in my nightstand, I realized that the road ahead would be long and painful. But for the first time, I wasn't running from it. I was ready to face it, one step at a time. The next few weeks were a blur of emotions and appointments. Therapy was harder than I expected. Sitting across from someone whose job it was to pick apart my thoughts to make me confront the darkest parts of myself felt like a betrayal. I wasn't sure I was ready to face all of it, but deep down, I knew I had no choice. I went through the motions, answering questions I hadn't wanted to ask myself. Why had I done it? Why had I betrayed Mark when he loved me so much? What was I running from? The answers came slowly, one agonizing layer at a time. I learned more about myself in those sessions than I ever expected. I learned that my need for validation, whether from Mark, from other people, or even from myself, had always been tied to an insecurity I couldn't shake. I'd spent so long feeling like I wasn't enough, always second-guessing my worth, that I had allowed myself to be swept up in fleeting moments of attention, of excitement, of something that made me feel important. But none of it was real. None of it could ever replace the one person I had truly loved. I still hadn't heard from Mark, and each day without him felt like another brick in a wall I couldn't tear down. I didn't know where he was or what he was doing, but I tried to focus on what I could control. I reached out to some of the people I had hurt, beginning with the friends I'd betrayed. The awkwardness of those conversations was unbearable at first, but it was a necessary part of facing the consequences of my actions. I apologized to Ben, to Luke, and to the others. Most of them were gracious, some indifferent, but it didn't matter. They didn't owe me forgiveness, but I needed to make things right, at least in my own mind. And yet, despite all of my efforts, to repair the damage I had caused, the thing that gnawed at me the most was the absence of Mark. I couldn't erase the memory of his face when he walked out the door, and no matter how many steps I took toward healing, it felt like I was walking through life with a gaping hole in my chest. One evening, I sat on the couch, staring at the phone in my hand. I had drafted text after text, message after message, only to delete them before sending. I wanted to reach out to him, to tell him how sorry I was, how much I missed him. But I didn't know if it was too soon. I didn't know if he was ready to hear from me. The phone buzzed, interrupting my thoughts. I looked down and saw his name on the screen. My heart leapt, a mix of excitement and fear. I took a deep breath and answered. Mark? There was a long pause on the other end. I could hear the faint sound of him breathing. Ava, he said quietly. I'm not sure what to say, but I think we need to talk. I swallowed hard, my voice trembling. I agree. I've been waiting, hoping for this. Where are you? He asked. Home, I replied, my heart pounding. Where are you? I'll be there in 20 minutes. I hung up the phone, my hands shaking. The anticipation in my chest was almost unbearable. I had no idea what was about to happen. Part of me feared that this conversation would be the final nail in the coffin, that Mark had already made up his mind to leave me for good. Another part of me clung to the hope that he had come back for a reason, that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to rebuild what we had. I paced the house, unable to sit still, until I heard the faint sound of the front door opening. My breath caught in my throat as I turned toward the hallway. Mark stood there, framed by the doorway, his face tired and guarded. He was still the man I loved, but there was a distance between us now that I didn't know how to bridge. Hi, I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. Hi, he replied, his tone equally quiet. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. There was so much to say, but neither of us knew where to start. Finally, Mark took a step forward, his eyes never leaving mine. I don't know what to do with all of this, he said, gesturing between us. I don't know if I can forgive you, Eva, but I also know that I can't just walk away without trying. Tears filled my eyes and I nodded, my throat tight. I don't know if I deserve your forgiveness, but I want to try, Mark. I want to do whatever it takes. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. I need time, Eva. I need space to think about what this means for me, for us. But I also need you to know that I'm not just walking away either. I wanted to reach out, to pull him into my arms, but I held myself back. There was too much between us now, too much pain, too many broken pieces. I understand, I whispered. Take the time you need. I'll be here. Mark nodded, his expression softening just a little. We'll figure it out, he said quietly, before turning and walking out the door again. I stood there, staring at the empty space where he had just been, unsure of what came next. All I knew was that for the first time in a long while, I felt like maybe there was hope. Not for everything to be okay, but for the possibility of healing, one day at a time. The days stretched into weeks, each one feeling like a test I wasn't sure I was passing. I kept telling myself that things were moving forward, that Mark and I were both working towards something better, but it felt more like we were two strangers, circling each other in an endless dance, neither one of us willing to make the first move. I kept going to therapy, kept working through the layers of myself I had spent so long avoiding. It wasn't easy. Each session left me feeling more exposed, like I was tearing myself open just to see what was inside. But slowly, piece by piece, I started to understand my own pain, my own mistakes. I learned that the affair wasn't just about sex. It was about feeling unseen, about needing to prove something to myself that I couldn't name. In the weeks that followed, I reached out to Mark several times, but he was always distant, his replies short and polite. It was clear that he wasn't ready to come back, that he wasn't sure if he ever would. It was painful, but I had to respect it. I had to give him the space he needed, even though every part of me wanted to pull him close and fix everything, right now, right this minute. And yet, every day I spent alone in this house, every quiet morning and empty evening, I found myself wondering if this was it, that maybe I had lost him for good. I wasn't naive enough to believe that things would just fall back into place. Relationships, real relationships, weren't like that. They were fragile, complicated, and never, ever perfect. One evening, I found myself walking to the mailbox to collect the mail, something I hadn't done in days. As I sorted through the bills, the junk mail, and a few magazines, I noticed something unfamiliar. A thick envelope, addressed to me in Mark's handwriting. My heart raced as I tore open the envelope, not sure what to expect. Inside, there was a single letter, folded neatly. I unfolded it, and as I read his words, I felt my breath catch in my throat. Ava, I've thought a lot about us. About everything. I've spent so much time angry, hurt, confused, and I know that nothing will ever change what's happened. But I also know that I can't just walk away from everything we've shared. We've built a life together, and I can't just forget that. I'm not ready to make any promises yet. I need more time, but I want you to know that I'm not giving up on us completely. I'm willing to try, Eva, if you are too. Mark? I stared at the letter for what felt like an eternity. My hands were shaking and my mind was racing. This was the breakthrough I had been waiting for, the lifeline I had hoped for, but I wasn't sure how to respond. Mark wasn't promising anything. He wasn't saying we could go back to how things were, but he was offering a chance. I sat down on the edge of the couch, the letter still in my hands. I had spent so long waiting for a sign, for him to tell me what I wanted to hear, but now that I had it, I realized how much of this was on me. I couldn't keep waiting for him to fix things. I had to take responsibility for my actions, for my choices, and for my own healing. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if Mark and I would ever be the same, if we could rebuild what we had lost. But what I did know, what I could control, was that I was going to keep moving forward. I had spent so much time worrying about the outcome, about whether Mark would forgive me, about whether he would stay, that I had forgotten the most important part of this journey, learning to forgive myself. Mark's decision, his willingness to try again, wasn't the answer to all my problems. It was a chance, a new beginning, but it didn't guarantee anything. But what I could control was my own healing. What I could do was keep showing up for myself, day after day, and continue working toward becoming the person I wanted to be. Not just for Mark, but for me. The next few days passed in a strange limbo. I saw Mark once or twice, but the conversations were still cautious, tentative. We were still trying to find our footing, still unsure of where we were headed. It wasn't easy. Some days felt like progress, others like we were stuck in the same old patterns. But it was something. One evening, after an especially difficult conversation, I sat in my living room, staring at the photo of our wedding day. I had always loved that picture. It was a reminder of the love we had once shared, a symbol of the person I used to be, the person who believed in love and commitment without question. That person felt so distant now. But maybe, just maybe, I could find her again. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if Mark and I would ever fully recover, if we would find a way to move past the mistakes I had made. But what I did know was this: I had the power to change, to grow, to make better choices. And that had to be enough. I picked up my phone and typed a message to Mark. "I'm here when you're ready to talk. No rush. Just take care of yourself." I hit send and leaned back on the couch, the weight of everything still pressing on me, but also a glimmer of hope. Not a grand, sweeping hope, but the kind of quiet hope that grows in the cracks of a broken heart. The kind of hope that can't be forced, but is earned, one day at a time. The days blurred together, each one feeling like a constant oscillation between hope and doubt. Mark and I continued to navigate the uncertain waters of our relationship, a strange, fragile kind of peace settling over us, but never fully taking root. There were moments when we seemed close, when the connection felt like it might rebuild itself. But just as often, I found myself wondering if it was all enough. Could we ever get back to who we had been before everything fell apart? Or was the damage too deep, the hurt too ingrained in our history? I still wasn't sure. We spent more time together, but it was different now. The conversations were careful, even stilted at times. We didn't talk about the affair as much, not directly, but there was a lingering tension, an unspoken understanding that things would never be the same. And maybe that was okay. Maybe we didn't need to go back to what we once were. We just needed to figure out who we were now, together, despite everything. Mark never fully let his guard down, and I didn't blame him. I had done the unthinkable. He was working through his own pain, his own confusion, and I couldn't rush that. I couldn't expect him to forgive me in a day or a week or even a year. What we had was fragile, but it was also real, and we both seemed to be committed to the idea that maybe, just maybe, it could still work. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic moments of reconciliation. Instead, we lived in the quiet spaces, between words, the small gestures that told me he wasn't ready to let go, that he wasn't quite ready to walk away. We were learning to navigate this new reality, one where trust had to be rebuilt, and where love didn't feel like it could be taken for granted. But then, one night, after another of our long, somewhat strained conversations, Mark looked at me and finally said something that stopped me cold. "I think we're getting there," he said, his voice softer than I expected. I think I'm starting to see the person I fell in love with again. It's not easy. I'm still angry, still hurt. But I'm here, Eva. I'm still here." Those words felt like a lifeline, a small thread that I could hold on to. But they also reminded me of how fragile we still were, of how much work was ahead of us. I couldn't take those words for granted. I knew how much they cost him to say, and I knew how much they meant to me. I nodded, fighting back the tears that threatened to overwhelm me. "I'm here too. I'm not going anywhere." It wasn't a promise that everything would be perfect. It wasn't a declaration that everything would be fixed. But it was enough. It was a step forward, a recognition that we were both willing to keep trying, even if we didn't have all the answers. The rest of the night passed in silence. We sat together on the couch, not speaking, just existing in the same space. And somehow that felt like the most honest thing we had done in a long time. I was going to keep working on myself, keep going to therapy, keep facing my mistakes, and learning from them. And if Mark was willing to try, then I would be right there with him, taking it one step at a time. That night, I wrote him a response. I didn't have all the answers, but I knew that the only way forward was with honesty, with patience, and with a willingness to fight for something that mattered. "Mark, I don't have all the answers, and I can't promise that I'll always get it right. But I'm here, and I want to try too. I want to rebuild, piece by piece, and I'm ready to face whatever comes next, with you or without you. Eva." I sealed the letter and left it on the kitchen table for him to find when he came by to pick up the rest of his things. I wasn't sure when that would be, but I knew that I had finally done what I needed to do. I had put my heart on the line, not just for Mark, but for myself. The next few days passed in a haze of nervous anticipation. I didn't hear from Mark immediately, and my mind raced with what could be happening, what he could be thinking. Was He still processing? Was he already pulling away? I had no way of knowing. But one morning, as I walked into the kitchen, I saw a familiar figure standing by the counter, looking at me. "Mark," I said, my voice breaking. He smiled softly, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "Hey," he said quietly, "I got your letter." "I wasn't sure if you'd come by today," I said, my hands trembling. "I wasn't sure either," he replied. He paused, then added, "I still don't know what the future holds, Eva, but I'm willing to try, together." I nodded, tears filling my eyes. "I'm ready," I whispered. And in that moment, with all the uncertainty and pain still lingering between us, I knew that this was the beginning of something new. Not a perfect resolution, not an easy path, but a chance to rebuild, to grow, and to learn to love again. Together, or apart, I had learned the hardest lesson of all. Healing didn't come with quick fixes or easy answers. It came with time, with effort, and with the courage to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. That afternoon, after Mark left, the quiet settled over the house like a heavy blanket. I sat down on the couch, staring at the empty space where he'd been just moments ago. His words echoed in my head, but they didn't bring the relief I'd expected. The uncertainty was still there, thick and suffocating. We were standing at the edge of something, but I wasn't sure what. A new beginning? A tentative truce? Or just the fragile remnants of something that might never be whole again? I spent the rest of the day thinking about everything I had learned. About myself, about Mark, about the relationship we shared. Therapy had helped me understand the why behind my actions, but the deeper questions still lingered. Could we truly heal? Could I? I still couldn't shake the image of the man I had betrayed, the man who had loved me despite my flaws, despite my mistakes. Mark had told me he wasn't sure about anything yet, but that he was willing to try. His willingness to give us another shot was both a gift and a burden. The pressure of that decision hung over me, and I couldn't help but wonder how long that hope would last. The hardest part of it all, I realized, wasn't just the hurt I had caused Mark, it was the hurt I had caused myself. I had spent so long living in a haze of self-doubt, chasing validation and excitement in all the wrong places, that I had lost sight of the person I used to be, the person I had wanted to be. And now, here I was, on the other side of everything, trying to rebuild a sense of self that didn't depend on external approval, trying to rebuild a marriage that had been fractured by my own choices. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street. The world seemed to go on without any regard for the chaos in my life, and I envied that. But I also realized that I couldn't keep waiting for someone else to fix things. The change had to come from me, from the inside out. That evening, I received a text from Mark. "I'm thinking about what you said," it read. "I'll call you tomorrow. I think we need to talk more. I just need some time to sort through everything." I stared at the screen, the message sending my heart into overdrive. Time. That was the one thing I had learned I couldn't rush. I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I set my phone down and walked into the kitchen. I needed to do something, anything, to keep my mind from spiraling into doubt. I put on some music, made myself a cup of tea, and just let myself breathe for a few minutes. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I wasn't sure if I was ready for whatever came next, but I knew that I couldn't avoid it anymore. The waiting, the hoping, the wishing for a perfect resolution, it wasn't going to come. As I sat there sipping my tea, I realized something else. Every attempt to reach out had been met with nothing more than a cold response. Every word I said seemed to fall flat, like I was speaking to a stranger, not the man I had once loved with everything I had. My chest ached with the weight of the unspoken words. I wanted to ask him how he was feeling, to tell him that I was sorry, but I was afraid that doing so would only push him further away. He had already told me that he needed space, and as much as I hated it, I respected that. I woke up one morning to find a note on the kitchen counter. It wasn't much, just a few words, scribbled hastily. "I'm staying at my friend's place for a while. I'll be back when I'm ready." The words hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't been expecting. Not like this. I had known that something was coming, but seeing it written down, seeing the finality of it in black and white, was like the last straw. I felt the walls closing in around me, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. He was gone. Really gone. He had made up his mind. I didn't know what to do with myself. I stood there in the kitchen, staring at the note, willing myself not to cry, but the tears came anyway. They were slow at first, but then they came faster, until I was sobbing, unable to stop. I had pushed him too far. I had let him slip away, until there was nothing left but the echo of what used to be. I tried to pull myself together. I couldn't afford to fall apart completely. I couldn't let him see me like this, not when he came back. I knew he would come back eventually. He would need his space, but he wouldn't stay away forever. He couldn't. Or at least, that's what I told myself. The next few days were a blur of empty nights and silent mornings. I tried to focus on work, on other things, but nothing seemed to matter anymore. It was like everything had lost its meaning without him. Without us. I wanted to text him, to call him, but I didn't. I had learned the hard way that pushing him wouldn't work. I needed to give him time, as much as it hurt. I had no choice but to wait. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the phone buzzed. It was a message from him. "We need to talk." I felt a rush of relief mixed with a rush of panic. He was coming back. He wanted to talk. But what did that mean? Was it a good thing? Was it the beginning of something new? Or was it just a way for him to tell me that he couldn't do this anymore? I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. The message wasn't clear. It wasn't an invitation to fix things. It wasn't an apology. It was just a simple request. We need to talk. I didn't know what he would say. I didn't know if I was ready to hear it. But I also knew that this was my chance to finally do what I had been avoiding for so long, to listen, to understand, to acknowledge the hurt I had caused him. I didn't know if it would be enough. I didn't know if anything could be enough. But all I could do was wait for him to come back, and hope that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to fix what I had broken. When he came back, I had no idea what to expect. I was both terrified and hopeful. It was the moment of truth. But as I waited, the question still hung in the air. Could we ever find our way back to each other, or had we already reached the end? And would I be able to face the consequences of my actions no matter what he decided? As the days went by, I found myself slowly healing, though I still wasn't sure if we were moving towards something stronger or if we were just holding on to each other because it was all we knew. But for the first time in a long time, I realized that I was starting to forgive myself. I was starting to accept that I wasn't perfect, that I had made mistakes, but that didn't mean I couldn't try to be better. I was still flawed, but I was learning, I was changing. And as I looked at Mark, I saw the same thing in him. We weren't the people we used to be, but maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. Maybe the people we were becoming, broken, bruised, but still standing, were worth fighting for. The road ahead was still uncertain. We were still navigating the cracks in our relationship, still working through the mess we had made. But the future no longer seemed impossible. And maybe, just maybe, we would make it through. Together. If you've ever found yourself at a crossroads in your relationship, unsure of whether to rebuild or walk away, you're not alone. Healing is a journey, one that requires patience, self-reflection, and above all, a willingness to face the truth. What steps are you taking today to heal and rebuild?